Joshua and the Walls of Jericho, a miracle of faith and obedience. The story of Joshua and the collapse of Jericho's walls is one of the most dramatic and faith-inspiring narratives in the entire Bible. It is not merely a tale of military conquest, but a profound lesson on the power of unwavering faith, complete obedience, and the certainty that God fights for his people when they follow his commands. The imposing, seemingly impregnable walls of a mighty city fell not by conventional siege weapons or brute force, but through a divine strategy that required nothing but trust and obedience from the Israelites. Historical and theological background. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness as a consequence of their disobedience and lack of faith, a new generation of Israelites stood on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, poised to enter the promised land of Canaan. Their great leader Moses had died, and the immense responsibility of leadership had fallen upon Joshua, son of Nun. Joshua was not a novice. He had been Moses' faithful aide and a courageous warrior. He was one of the 12 spies who, decades earlier, had entered Canaan. Only he and Caleb had returned with a report full of faith, believing that God could give them the land despite its powerful inhabitants. Now, as the leader, his first major obstacle was the ancient and fiercely fortified city of Jericho. Jericho was a key strategic city, often called the City of Palm Trees. It was a gateway city, controlling the passes into the central hill country of Canaan. Its defenses were formidable. Archaeological evidence and the biblical description suggest it had massive double walls, with the outer wall being about 6 feet thick and the inner wall about 12 feet thick, rising to heights of up to 25–30 feet. Homes were built atop these walls, making them a seemingly insurmountable barrier for any army, let alone a nomadic group like the Israelites. Divine reassurance in the promise. Facing such a daunting challenge, Joshua must have felt the weight of his new role. It is in this moment of uncertainty that God provides him with a crucial divine encounter. As Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua, a soldier, approached him and asked, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The man replied, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Joshua 5:13–14. This was no ordinary warrior. Joshua fell on his face to the ground in reverence and worshipped, understanding he was in the presence of a theophany, a manifestation of God himself or his chief angel. This encounter served to shift Joshua's perspective from the human military challenge to the divine reality. This was the Lord's battle. The commander instructed Joshua to take off his sandals, for the place where he was standing was holy ground, a moment echoing God's call to Moses at the burning bush. The message was clear: Joshua was not alone. The same God who had parted the Red Sea was with him. God then delivered his promise. "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and its mighty men of valor." Joshua 6:2. The victory was already assured. It was now Joshua's task to receive it through faith and obedience. The spies and Rahab, a seed of faith in Jericho. Prior to this, Joshua had sent 2 spies into Jericho to assess the city. They found lodging in the house of a woman named Rahab, who lived in a house built into the city wall. Rahab was a Canaanite and a prostitute, an unlikely candidate for a heroine of faith. Yet, when the king of Jericho learned of the spies and demanded Rahab hand them over, she made a courageous decision. She hid the spies on her roof under stalks of flax and lied to the king's men, sending them on a wild goose chase outside the city. She then helped the spies escape through her window by a rope. Her actions were driven by a remarkable confession of faith. She said to the spies, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." Joshua 2:9–11. In return for her protection, the spies promised to spare Rahab and her family when the Israelites attacked. They instructed her to tie a scarlet cord in the same window she used to lower them down. This cord would be the sign for the Israelite army to pass over her house. Rahab's story is a powerful testament that faith can blossom in the most unexpected places, and that God's grace extends to all who turn to Him in truth, regardless of their past. The unconventional battle plan. With the spies' report confirming the fear in the land, Joshua prepared the people to cross the Jordan River. In another miracle mirroring the Red Sea, the waters of the Jordan piled up in a heap as soon as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river bank. The entire nation crossed on dry ground. This act fortified their faith and terrified their enemies further. Now came the time for Jericho. The people likely expected Joshua to outline a military strategy for siege and assault. Instead, he gathered them and relayed God's inexplicable and seemingly absurd battle plan. All the armed men would march around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests would carry trumpets of ram's horns, shofars, in front of the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times. On the 7th lap on the 7th day, the priests would blow the trumpets with a long blast. Upon that signal, the entire army was to give a mighty shout. God promised that after the shout, the walls of the city would collapse, and the army could charge straight in. Humanly speaking, this strategy was ridiculous. Marching and shouting were not siege tactics. It would have seemed like a waste of time and energy, making the Israelites a laughingstock to the watchful defenders on Jericho's walls. Yet, Joshua did not question. He commanded the people to obey. 6 days of silent obedience. For 6 days, the Israelite procession unfolded exactly as commanded. In complete silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the blast of the 7 shofars, they marched. The armed men led the way, followed by the 7 trumpeting priests, followed by the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, with the rest of the people forming a rear guard. One can only imagine the scene. Inside Jericho, the inhabitants watched with confusion, anxiety, and perhaps mockery. Each day, the mighty army would appear, march a silent lap, and then return to their camp. Nothing happened. The walls stood firm. For the Israelites, these 6 days were a test of faith and obedience. Would they trust a God whose methods made no logical sense? Would they continue to follow a plan that showed no immediate results? Their silent march was an act of profound faith. The 7th day, the miracle unfolds. On the 7th day, they rose at dawn. This day was different. They did not march once but began a second, then a third lap. The tension and anticipation must have been palpable. They completed a 4th, 5th, and 6th circuit. The walls still stood, silent and imposing. Then they began the 7th lap. As they completed it, the priests blew a long, piercing blast on the shofars. Joshua raised his voice and commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Joshua 6:16. The air was shattered by a tremendous, unified shout from thousands of throats. A shout of faith, a shout of praise, a shout of triumph in a promise not yet visible. And then the miracle happened. The people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Joshua 6:20. The ground shook. The massive stone foundations gave way. The mighty walls of Jericho collapsed inward upon themselves, creating a ramp of rubble over which the Israelite army could charge straight before them, into every part of the city. The city that had seemed impregnable was taken in a moment. True to their word, Joshua spared Rahab and her family. The 2 spies were sent to bring her out from her house, which remained standing, a solitary section of the wall left intact by God's providence, marked by the scarlet cord. She and her family were incorporated into the community of Israel, and she later became an ancestor of King David and, ultimately, Jesus Christ. Aftermath and enduring lessons. The victory was total. Jericho was devoted to the Lord, meaning its valuables were consecrated to the tabernacle, and the rest was destroyed. This severe judgment was a specific command for this specific city, which stood as the firstfruit of the conquest, and a symbol of the idolatry and sin of Canaan. The story of Jericho is far more than a historical account. It is a masterclass in spiritual principles that remain deeply relevant. The primacy of faith. The victory was won not by Israel's military might but by their faith in God's promise. Hebrews 11:30 commemorates this event. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. The necessity of obedience. Joshua and the people followed God's instructions exactly, even when they seemed foolish. Their precise obedience was the channel through which God's power flowed. Partial obedience would not have worked. God's ways are not our ways. Human strategy was set aside for divine strategy. God often works in ways that confound human wisdom to ensure that the glory for the victory goes to Him alone. The power of patience and persistence. The 6 days of silent marching required immense patience. Faith often involves waiting and persevering in obedience long before we see the result. The inclusivity of faith. Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, is celebrated for her faith. Her story demonstrates that God's salvation is available to anyone, from any background, who turns to Him in faith. The call to corporate faith. This was not an individual effort. The entire nation had to participate in unity, marching, waiting, and shouting together. There is power when God's people act in unified faith. Conclusion. The crumbling walls of Jericho stand as an eternal monument to a simple truth. No obstacle is too great when God is in the equation. The walls we face in our own lives, fear, addiction, financial crisis, broken relationships, impossible situations, may seem as formidable as Jericho's fortifications. The story of Joshua calls us to confront them not with anxiety and human effort alone, but with faith, patient obedience, and the unwavering belief that the battle belongs to the Lord. When we follow His direction, even when it seems illogical, we position ourselves to witness the miraculous, watching our own walls fall down flat. Amen. God bless you.